Today we will continue The Last Week by Mark L. Borg and John Dominic Crossan. Page 5, Jerusalem. Jerusalem was not just any city. By the first century, it had been the center of sacred geography of the Jewish people for a millennium, and ever since it has been central to the sacred imagination of both Jews and Christians. Its associations are both positive and negative. It is the city of God and the faithless city, the city of hope and the city of oppression, the city of joy and the city of pain. Jerusalem became the capital of ancient Israel in the time of King David, around 1000 BCE. Under David and his son Solomon, Israel experienced the greatest period in its history. The country was united, all 12 tribes under one king. It was at its largest, it was powerful, and thus its people were safe from marauding neighbors. A glorious temple was built by Solomon in Jerusalem. David's reign in particular, and not Solomon's, was seen not only as a time of power and glory, but also of justice and righteousness in the land. David was a just and righteous king. He became associated with goodness, power, protection, and justice. He was the ideal shepherd king, the apple of God's eye, even God's son. The time of glory, the ideal time, was remembered. So revered did David become that the hoped-for future deliverer, the Messiah, was expected to be a son of David, a new David, indeed greater than David. And this new David, this son of David, would rule a restored kingdom from Jerusalem. Jerusalem was thus associated with Israel's hope of future glory, a glory involving justice and peace as much or more than it involved power. David's son Solomon built the temple in Jerusalem in the 900s BCE. It became the sacred center of the Jewish world within the theology that developed around it. It was the navel of the earth, connecting this world to its source and God. And here, and only here, was God's dwelling place on earth. Of course, ancient Israel also affirmed that God was everywhere. Heaven and the highest heaven could not contain God, and God's glory filled the earth. But God was especially present in the temple. To be in the temple was to be in God's presence. The temple mediated not only God's presence, but also God's forgiveness. It was the only place of sacrifice, and sacrifice was the means of forgiveness. According to temple theology, some sins could be forgiven, and some kinds of impurities could be dealt with only through temple sacrifice. As the mediator of forgiveness and purification, the temple mediated access to God. To stand in the temple, purified and forgiven, was to stand in the presence of God. The temple was thus a center of devotion and the destination of pilgrimage. The devotion evoked by Jerusalem is movingly expressed in a collection of psalms, Psalm 120 through 34, used by Jewish pilgrims as they went up to Jerusalem on pilgrimage, commonly called songs of ascent. They speak of the yearning and joy engendered by Jerusalem as the city of God. The house of the Lord is the temple. I was glad when they said to me, "Let us go to the house of the Lord. Our feet are standing within your gates, O Jerusalem. Pray for the peace of Jerusalem. May they prosper who love you." When the Lord restored the fortunes of Zion, we were like those who dream. Then our mouth was filled with laughter, and our tongue with shouts of joy. For the Lord has chosen Zion. God has desired it for God's habitation. This is my resting place forever. Here I will reside, for I have desired it. Psalm 122, 1 through 2, 6, 126, 1 through 2, 132, 13 through 14. But Jerusalem, the city of God, also acquired negative associations, because beginning in the half century after King David, it became the center of a domination system. Because this notion is so important for understanding a conflict that runs through the Bible as a whole, and the last week of Jesus' life in particular, we pause here to explain it. The phrase domination system is shorthand for the most common form of social system, a way of organizing a society. In ancient and pre-modern times, that is, in pre-industrial agrarian societies, it names a social system marked by three major features. Number 1, political oppression. In such societies, the many were ruled by the few, the powerful and wealthy elites, the monarchy, nobility, aristocracy, and their associates. Ordinary people had no voice in the shaping of the society. Number 2, economic exploitation. A high percentage of the society's wealth, which came primarily from agricultural production in pre-industrial societies, went into the coffers of the wealthy and powerful, between 1/2 and 2/3 of it. How did they manage to do this? By the way they set the system up, through the structures and laws about land ownership, taxation, indenture of labor through debt, and so forth. Number 3, religious legitimation. In ancient societies, these systems were legitimated or justified with religious language. The people were told the king ruled by divine right. The king was the Son of God, the social order reflected the will of God, and the powers that be were ordained by God. Of course, religion sometimes became the source of protest against these claims. But in most pre-modern societies known to us, religion has been used to legitimate the place of the wealthy and powerful in the social order over which they preside. There is nothing unusual about this form of society. Monarchical and aristocratic rule by a wealthy few began about 5,000 years ago and was the most common form of social system in the ancient world. With various permutations, it persisted through the medieval and early modern periods until the democratic revolutions of the last few hundred years, and one could make a good case that in somewhat different form it remains with us today. In this sense, domination systems are normal, not abnormal, and thus can also be called the normalcy of civilization. Thus, we will use both phrases to name the socio-economic political order in which ancient Israel, Jesus, and early Christianity lived. Domination system calls attention to its central dynamic, the political and economic domination of the many by a few, and the use of religious claims to justify it. The religious version is that God has set society up this way. The secular version is that this is the way things are, and the best they can be for everybody. Normalcy of civilization calls attention to how common it is. There is nothing unusual or abnormal about this state of affairs. It is what most commonly happens. We return to the emergence of this social system in ancient Israel. Under David's son and successor, Solomon, power and wealth were increasingly concentrated in Jerusalem. In effect, Solomon had become a new Pharaoh, and Egypt had been recreated in Israel. And though Israel split into two kingdoms when Solomon died in 922 BCE, the northern kingdom Israel and the southern kingdom Judah, with its capital in Jerusalem, the domination system persisted through the remaining centuries of the monarchy, and as we suggest later in this chapter, it was the form of social system confronted by Jesus and early Christianity. The negative associations of Jerusalem are especially strong in the prophets of ancient Israel, whose words by the time of Jesus were part of the Jewish Bible. As the home of the monarchy and the aristocracy of wealth and power, Jerusalem became the center of injustice and of betrayal of God's covenant. God's passion for justice had been replaced by human injustice. To illustrate, we begin with Micah, an 8th century BCE prophet. He asks, "What is the sin of Judah?" His surprising answer takes the form of a rhetorical question. Is it not Jerusalem? It is a striking claim. The sin of Judah is a city, indeed the city of God. His indictment of the rulers is explicit. Listen, you heads of Jacob and rulers of the house of Israel. Should you not know justice? You who hate the good and love the evil, who tear the skin off my people and the flesh off their bones. Hear this, you rulers, who abhor justice and pervert all equity, who build Zion with blood and Jerusalem with wrong. Chapter 3, verse 1 through 2 and 9 through 10. In the same century, the prophet Isaiah indicted the rulers of Jerusalem as rulers of Sodom and its inhabitants as people of Gomorrah, two ancient cities legendary for their injustice. Chapter 1, verse 10. His language is shocking and harsh. How the faithful city has become a whore. She that was full of justice, righteousness, lodged in her, but now murderers. Your princes are rebels and the companions of thieves. Everyone loves a bribe and runs after gifts. They do not defend the orphan, and the widow's cause does not come before them. Chapter 1, verse 21 and 23. At the conclusion of his parable of the vineyard, Isaiah said about the beloved but faithless city, God expected justice, but saw bloodshed, righteousness, but heard a cry. Chapter 5, verse 7. To its rulers he said, you call evil good and good evil, who put darkness for light and light for darkness, who put bitter for sweet and sweet for bitter. Chapter 5, verse 20. The same themes sound in the late 7th and early 6th century BCE by the prophet Jeremiah. Run to and fro through the streets of Jerusalem. Look around and take note. Search it square and see if you can find one person who acts justly and seeks truth. Has this house, the temple,